Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening. We are in the process of letting folks in, so give us a minute or two as that happens, and then we'll get our program started. I'm Stephen Kent with Côte Cabernet Franc, and I just want to set a context for where we are in the world at this moment in time. We're at Uncle Yu's restaurant at the Vineyard in the Livermore Valley. And this is absolutely one of the finest restaurants in the Tri-Valley with one of the great wine programs in California. When I want a glass of great wine for lunch, I go to Nick Liang's, Uncle Yu's. Nick has been so gracious to allow us to film from the restaurant. And we are excited about bringing you a roundtable discussion with some great winemakers from around the world. Cabernet Franc is a worldwide phenomenon, and we're, I think, just about starting its moment in California. Hopefully it will be a very, very long moment. And I'm joined by some amazing winemakers. A winemaker right now, we're getting our French participant on board as well, but I'm with John Skupny from Lang & Reed in St. Helena, one of my good friends in the Cabernet Franc world. And this is how this is gonna work. We're using a roundtable, Lazy Susan, so John and I can kind of share a screen. So if you hear a little clicking, that's the roundtable, and you'll see us come in and out of picture. John, welcome. So happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome everybody. It's a beautiful spring day here in Northern California. I thought I was going to confront an enormous amount of traffic, but I got to see all the blooming trees. So far, when you think about the difference, what a difference a day or a year makes. Last year at the same time, I was taking pictures in a vineyard where we were just seeing serious bud break take place. Right. And it's happening again. A lot of water has gone into the bridge since then. And one of that waves of water is how to communicate with people in the world. And I'm really feeling very blessed and fortunate to be sitting here right now in a great restaurant with Cabernet Franc in front of me and a lot of people who are interested in Cabernet Franc. So back to you.
It's fantastic. We're indeed very fortunate to be where we are now. The world is a crazy place, obviously. Hopefully less crazy every day. Mattieu Baudry from Domaine Bernard Baudry will be joining us soon from Chinon. He will be joining the discussion as we talk about kind of the sort of old world, but in my mind, the perpetually wonderful world of Loire Valley Cab Franc. We are looking forward to talking with you. This is not a this is not a seminar. This is a roundtable discussion about why we are so in love with Cabernet Franc, why we believe so strongly in this variety, and why we think that it is the most delicious, alluring, compelling, sexiest grape out there. And we will discuss some winemaking and some terroir-driven aspects of our growing areas and the wines that we make. But I sort of want this to be more about how Cab Franc is, how it shapes our wine lives from a drinking standpoint, how it shapes our wine lives with a wine and food standpoint, those kinds of relationships. So please, by all means, hit the chat button on the bottom of the screen if you have a question. We'll get to it as quickly as we can. If you can keep your microphone on mute until we have a chance to get to you, that would be really, really helpful. We have 63 people in the room right now. I think we have 120 some odd people registered, so we're about halfway through. I'm going to ask you, John, since we're still waiting on that too. You've been in the wine business for a gratifyingly long time, and you've been in part of making a lot of different wines in your career. Tell us a little bit about your career and why Cab Franc ultimately.
Well, I'm a transplanted Midwesterner who came to California in 1980. Between 1980 and the founding of, or making our first Cabernet Franc in 1993, I worked for about 15 or 20 different Northern California wineries, mostly in the North Coast, actually one here in Livermore back in the early 80s. I then went on a path of moving to Napa Valley in 1984, and I spent 5 years with Camas, 4 years with Côte, 4 years with the Nibon Coppola estate, where the obvious focus was Cabernet Sauvignon. In the early 90s, my wife Tracy and I started to discuss the fact that maybe it's time that we would be able to build something for our own family. And what was it that inspired us? For the barrel tastings that we had been involved with for well over a decade by that time, mostly Bordeaux varieties in the cellars that we all worked at, we always found that Cabernet Franc presented itself early on in a really, really luscious and sort of dynamic way. And it was one of those things where in the springtime, you would go taste a barrel, and what would normally be pretty harsh or hard to handle at that point, Franc would always sort of just pop out of the glass and say, drink some more of me. So we had had a lot of experience with Loire wines when we had been in the restaurant trade back in the 70s, and thought that California had sort of short shrift Cabernet Franc. And we both felt that it would be really a shame to let Cabernet Franc wind up only being thought of as a blending tool. So in 1993, I bought a couple tons of Cabernet Franc from a vineyard in Oakville. Tony Soter, who I was working with at Coppola at the time, allowed me to custom crush kind of experimentally our first prototype. And we were very pleased with the results. We approached it in a slightly different way than I would have if I was making Cabernet Sauvignon. And over the course of the last 25 years, have tried to fine tune that to really expose the, what I call the sort of infinite charms of Cabernet Franc. We did not make wine in 94 and 95. It was simply because of raising two children and both of us having jobs that we sort of got sidetracked. But in 1996, we got what we call street legal, got out all of our license in line, and actually made our first commercial production of Cabernet Franc.
Let me ask you a question, interrupt for just a second. So you're in the restaurant trade in Kansas City, correct?
Right.
So you talked about Loire Valley wines in the 80s. What was the reception for Loire Valley from American audiences, I assume predominantly back then?
Well, I could tell you frankly, they were not as popular as, say, particularly in Kansas City, as German wines or Bordeaux wines or even Burgundy. But when people were sort of looking for something a little different, and or what really was even at that time perceived as a good value, it would be a really nice way to slide people into that. And Cabernet Franc is never, well, I should take that back. Cabernet Franc can be sort of a less volume sometimes in terms of impact and extract than Cabernet Sauvignon. And in its own way, a nice bridge between Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon. So as a sommelier, they didn't call us that then, they called us wine stewards. If I saw a table that had a group of people with really mixed menu and mixed sort of tastes, I could usually bring a Loire Cabernet Franc to that table and please the majority of the table, where if I'd let the host buy the big Cabernet Sauvignon that he wanted, it might overpower what his guests were having and that sort of thing. So I had already sort of had this intrinsic feeling that it was really something that people liked to drink. They just needed to understand it a little better.
How many bottles out of 10 were Cabernet Sauvignon?
On the list, it was actually more French list than a California list at that time. This was up until early 1980. But we had what we called Cabernet nights. So we probably had 10 or 15 California Cabernets. We had at least 15 or 20 Bordeaux wines there. It was a continental steakhouse. So given that platform, there was a lot of Cabernet being consumed, and actually a lot of very fine Burgundy too. It was an exciting time, and it was a little bit more maybe balanced in trying to understand and fit where California worked with the world scope, and now it seems to have turned a little bit differently the other way.
It's the sort of history of Cabernet Franc in California is a relatively recent one, as far as if you look at the California Great Crush Report going back, I think I looked through to 1975. There was no tonnage reported until 1977, and at that point it was a few hundred tons of Cabernet Franc. So it's a relatively recent grape in California. It's gone through kind of some cycles in terms of its popularity, but I think that over the last several years we've seen an uptick in tonnage, which equates, I'm sure, to acreage being planted. And I think that and we'll talk more about this in a little while. There are some areas I think that are going to end up evolving into fantastic Cabernet Franc areas that may have been Cabernet Sauvignon Blanc areas, or that may have been cooler climate grapes, Pinot Noir areas that will support Cab Franc. Just to give everyone kind of a context, if you're not sort of familiar with the history of Cab Franc, I'm going to try to adjust my screen here so I can get us both in, so we don't need to get you guys seasick here. And we can probably scoot together. We're at least semi-vaccinated.
Just be forewarned, I moved the spit bucket.
It's okay. It's okay. My shoes are dirty. How's that? Let's see here. There we go. There we are. Okay. Then John makes the screen look good now. Thank you. So Cabernet Franc is a grape that is reputed to have come, or at least thought to have come from, excuse me, I'm sorry about this. There we go. From southwest of France. And really kind of made its way up to the Loire Valley in the 17th century, in the 1600s. Cardinal Richelieu apparently was responsible for bringing cuttings up to the Loire Valley. Bishop Breton became sort of synonymous with the grape, and there's a Breton family making great Cabernet Franc in Bordeaux at this point in time. It didn't really get down to Bordeaux for another 100 years or so. I know we talked about Wikipedia and its relative accuracy.
Right.
And so if you look at Wikipedia, the mention of the first Cabernet Franc program in California really isn't accurate. There was Cab Franc being grown by other wineries prior to the 80s or whenever this particular denotation says it occurred. And up until I think probably the last, well, since you guys really started and kind of have been the forerunners of varietal Cab Franc in California, was a blending grape.
Exactly.
As it was in Bordeaux, as it remains in Bordeaux. And there is it's a beautiful thing, I think, to find grapes that ought to be singular expressions, that have been singular expressions in another part of the world, but now in our neck of the woods are becoming. We haven't reached the apotheosis yet, thankfully enough.
That's a big word.
But we're on our way there. Hopefully we've got decades and decades ahead of us. You're working in restaurants in the Midwest. Do you remember your first experience with Cab Franc from a tasting standpoint?
Well, I can think back in sort of my visual memory. I was very curious about basically that before we moved back to actually we got our first glimmer of what Cabernet Franc was all about. But then in exploring all the possibilities, I think it was probably Coulis du Thiel, Clos de Echo was probably the first one that I can visually remember tasting, because it's a very distinctive label. It's also a very distinctive vineyard on the crown hill of Chinon, where simultaneously I was looking at what was happening in California. And I found these notes about 6 months ago while I was exploring the fact that we'd moved to California 40 years beforehand. And I found tasting notes of serving a rep from Robert Mondavi Winery at our house in Kansas City. He would come in once every 6 weeks to do training for us. And after eating at all the great restaurants in Kansas City, we eventually invited him home. And I served him a 1974 varietally labeled Cabernet Franc from Mount Veeder Winery.
Okay.
The grape source was actually the Niebaum Coppola estate, which subsequently I was working for. So, as Stephen said, if you read Wikipedia, it exclaims a particular winery who did focus on Franc, but that they bottled the first varietally labeled California Franc, and it's a bit of a misnomer. What I know of in Napa Valley was the famous Dietert Vineyard now, which is on the far west edge of Tokelon, which is in the center of Napa Valley in Oakville. The Dietert family bought the property from Stelling, I believe, in 1949. And at that time, there was Cabernet Franc on the property, and it still is there. And it's been sold to Robert Mondavi Winery since sometime, I believe it was 66. It was embodied in the first reserve bottling that Mondavi did at that time, and was subsequently, still is, I believe, some goes to Mondavi each year. The Dietert family still exists in two different families. The Tom Garrett and his brother have Dietert Vineyard, and then I believe it's the McDonald's own the other half of the Dietert Vineyard. So it's a very interesting and singular expression of really old vine Cabernet Franc for New World.
That's spectacular. We'll talk about Livermore Valley history with Cabernet Franc. Learned a few things from one of our fellow winemakers here in the Valley, John Kinney from Ocasio Winery, who's not only a very, very smart guy and a good winemaker, but also a historian of sorts, especially about Livermore Valley history. And back, Livermore Valley is sort of the center of a lot of viticultural advent in California. Mattieu is joining. We're excited about that. So we'll get him on the screen as soon as we have him. Livermore Valley, really kind of the center of California Cabernet in terms of clonal material and its dissemination throughout California, as is it with the Wendy clone of Chardonnay. But going back a century, John was writing on his blog that Cabernet Franc was really one of the most important grapes in the Livermore Valley as well. And the weather conditions here are misapprehended by most people in terms of how hot or cold it is here. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Mattieu, do you hear us out there? He's still.
Yeah, I'm here.
Fabulous. Hi, welcome. Welcome from Chinon. Bonjour.
Bonsoir. Good morning.
Bonjour.
Sorry to be late, but I'm so bad. I could not find the link, but I'm here. That's fine.
We're happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. We've dipped into your wines. We're excited to talk about them. But as I was talking to John earlier, tell us a little bit about your family and about how you got into Cabernet Franc.
Yes, my dad started in '75 as a winemaker. The family Baudry is in the winemaking process for many generations, many decades, and probably some centuries. But my dad started by his own. My uncle took over the grandfather estate. So with a little vineyard, about 2 hectares of vines in Chinon, and I have joined him about 20 years now, 2001, and that's still a family estate. But the Bernard Baudry wines they have started in 1975 for the family.
So how old were you in 1975, if you don't mind my asking?
I born in '75. Exactly.
So it was an auspicious year for the family then. Congratulations to the family.
It's a very special year. Not many bottles left, unfortunately, because my dad had very good friends and they have opened a lot of it.
We're thirsty for it. So you were literally born into the business.
Yes, somewhere on this.
So your father, the family's been making wine for generations in the Loire Valley, in Chinon, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
And so what prompted your father to go off on his own with Domaine Bernard Baudry?
My dad went to school in Burgundy in the late 60s or middle of the 60s in Burgundy. And he spent about 5 years there, and he was impressed by the quality of the region, of the vineyard, of this Pinot Noir, of this monocépage, of this single grape. And when he went back to Chinon, he wanted to join the family estate owned by his brother, but the community was a bit tough, not so easy. And he started by his own, by renting vines from aunts, from uncles. And by renting vine, it started with these little vineyards called Les Gréseaux. And then little by little, he had opportunities to rent new vines and to buy new vines. And now we grow about 30 hectares of vines into the Chinon area. with that grape variety, which is the old grapes variety, which is controlled by the AOC, by the ENAO system in France. But Cabernet Franc is in Chinon for many centuries. It's an old local grapes of the area.
It's a different kind of a relationship for European winemakers, for French winemakers, than it is for California winemakers. And it's an interesting, there, you know, we have the ability, and sometimes it's a liability, too many choices. And oftentimes we plant the wrong things in California. So it's still a very young wine growing culture here in California, even though it's 160 plus years old at this point in time. And John, let me ask you this question, and Mattieu also join in. So you can have a region sort of choose you, as in Chinon, for instance, where, as you say, the AOC regulations allow you to plant certain varieties. In Chinon, it's Cabernet Franc. You can choose Cabernet Franc and you had experience with a lot of different kinds of varieties. Describe kind of that relationship with the region and choosing the grape very specifically, because that's sort of where you saw the brand headed, or where you saw your winemaking future headed.
Well, first and foremost, when I decided that I could make wine on a commercial level, I had been making homemade wine from 1980, so I had about 15 years of variously bad experiments under my belt. And I also saw that whatever I was going to do in my life, and I've been very fortunate to have my wife Tracy behind it, is I have to be involved in something that I really like, or really love, or have a passion for. And that extended all the way to the jobs that I took when I was working for other people. When I decided that we were going to focus on Cabernet Franc, it filled that bucket for me for doing something that we had a passion for. And secondly, on a business level, I basically tore out a page of Dan Duckhorn's book. I'd worked with Dan on multiple levels, both with the Vintners Association as well as selling grapes to him. And Dan said, you know, do one thing, do it really well, and then you can do anything you want. And, you know, obviously he made his mark with Merlot. That train had already been kind of on the track by the time I started thinking about what we would do in the 90s. But I knew that we had to keep it singular. We didn't need to confuse people. I had worked for operations where we made too many different types of wines. So what was this winery? Was it a Cabernet producer? Was it a Zinfandel producer or a Chardonnay producer? There were some anomalies in the California business, which frankly, Bernard and Mattieu, really where they're located, don't have that option to consider. It's basically Cabernet Franc and Chenin Blanc. And of course, I know that Mattieu makes a couple things on the side. I have a bottle of his Grolot in my cellar waiting to be opened, but that's not the topic today. But it was a passion for the grape, and the fact that we knew we had to do a niche. We didn't own or control our own vineyards, so we sort of, a little bit like Bernard did, had to go around in the kindness of others to help us amass sourcing of Cabernet Franc at that time. And we still work that way.
So Mattieu, what's it like? Where's the magic? Where's the magic in Chinon? Where's the magic in Cabernet Franc for you?
Wow. I think it's a fresh and juicy grapes, and I don't know, you're drinking and you feel well, because it's fresh, juicy. You can pair it quite easily with food, because even ripe, there's still something quite fresh, quite lively, and I think the herbal thing, that some people didn't like that much in the past, now they integrate it as a quality, because that helps to balance sometimes the level of sugar, and this grape is quite, I would say, it's not too much. It's a kind of balance. It's not so expressive. It doesn't overshow, and it's not a light grape. Yet some body, as well. So, and it's a perfect way also to have the soil feeling. I think it's quite transparent on the soil. I have the chance to share many kind of terroirs, alluvial soils, clay and limestone soil, white limestone, yellow limestone. And Cabernet Franc let the soil, let the transparency. I can feel some mineral salts from the limestone. I can feel sometimes some leather flavors from the gravels, and I like that grace maybe for that.
We'll talk more about
Yeah.
sort of the structure of the wines in just a second. We have a question from Jonathan aimed at John, producer in Sonoma in the 1980s who may have been from Saumur Champigny, who was making 100% Cab Franc, who recently passed away. Do you know who that person might be?
From Saumur, I'm not sure. I know that the Nelson family in the early 80s in Sonoma was producing or pegged themselves as a Cabernet Franc only winery, but I think they sort of folded up sometime in the late 90s and simply became growers. But that would be interesting. If it comes to mind,
Shout
I'll
it
think
out.
of it. Yeah.
Shout it out. So another comment, Nelson. So thank you, Jonathan, there you go. So the Nelson family involved in production of fruit and wine for at least a while. The question about, or a comment being made by one of the folks in the audience about Cabernet Franc being a blending grape in Bordeaux. And Mark Sherman, thanks Mark, a blending grape in Bordeaux, and for the longest time, and probably from a volume standpoint, still this way in California, it's more a blender than it is a varietal offering in California. So that's true. I think we're beginning to see, though, every year I look at the store shelves every month.
Oh, absolutely.
There are new Cabernet Franc producers out there. In California, in the U.S., if a wine is 75% or more of a grape, you can call it by that grape name. So Cabernet Franc, 75% or more. Mattieu, what do you think of the wines of Bordeaux, the right bank especially?
Mm-hmm.
And do you drink much Bordeaux?
No, I drink some Bordeaux, and I remember an experience that I had in the right bank in Saint-Emilion, drinking the Cabernet Franc from the tank as a sample, and I love it. And when I had to drink the Merlot, I was not as happy, but it was in my blood maybe, and it was in my head. And somewhere, the best wine, the best Saint-Emilion that I had was the blend with the Merlot and the Cabernet Franc. When there's that mix, 80-20 or 70-30, that works well in their region. That works perfectly. But some growers, they have tried 100% Cabernet Franc from the nice slopes of Saint-Emilion, and they were just magic for me. They were wonderful. And I think more and more growers are focusing or are coming back to that grapes more and more. When I was a student in Bordeaux in 1996, Cabernet Franc was not as fashion as it is now, and I think that was it's a shame.
It is a shame. I think we're hopefully headed in the right direction as far as plantings go, and sort of I think a segue to some comments we've gotten in the chat about if you could describe kind of the Loire Valley as a whole in a general way, and then talk about Chinon compared to Bourgogne or Saumur or other appellations. What's the major? How do you describe the Loire Valley as a whole first, and then how do you describe Chinon compared to that?
Loire Valley is quite long, as you know. Loire Valley starts from the Atlantic Ocean and goes almost until Burgundy, from Muscadet area to Sancerre. So it's quite a large area. Chinon is in the middle part of that region, and I would say, first of all, the climate. The climate is quite temperated, and we have those oceanic influence from the Atlantic Ocean. but temperature is not very cold, not very warm. So it's -4 Celsius. So I don't know about centigrade, but probably 20, 25 Fahrenheit and minimum. Maximum, yes, maybe 95 Fahrenheit. So that's quite temperated. And Chinon is somewhere, it's the meridional place of the Touraine area, of the Loire area. So the climate for me, is perfect for the Cabernet Franc. And Bourgueil is not so far, and we are quite close. We have the kind of same slope facing, soft facing. They have limestone. We have limestone. We are, I would say, cousin with Bourgueil. Saumur is a bit different because it's mostly a plateau with a lot of clay, so deep clay, and the limestone underneath. So the wines are a bit different. But there's a triangle of Cabernet Franc with Saumur, Chinon, Bourgueil, and those areas for me are very, very nice for that grape.
Well, so if I remember, John and I were talking about this, so on the Loire, the slopes are rising from one side. So you're kind of, the vineyards are rolling downhill in certain cases facing the river. So the river obviously has an important role to play in ripening and in temperature moderation and that sort of thing in your growing area, or do I have that wrong?
No, you're right. Most of the vineyards from the Loire are close to the river. They are facing the river. And the INAO system, the French regulation, sometimes tough, a bit complicated, but somewhere they like that vineyards are planted facing the river. But there are some vines on the left bank as well of the river in Chinon, and you are allowed to plant vines under the Chinon appellation on those slopes. You are talking about the river, which is important for the temperature regulation, but the forest as well has a huge importance in Chinon. Without that big forest behind Bourgueil and Chinon, I think Cabernet Franc would have some difficulty to ripe. So the forest is a barrier, is a fence against the cold wind that we can get from the northeast France and even northeast Europe. So that's all these parameters, all these things really help to get it ripe and nice.
What's the average growing temperature sort of for us, it would be sort of, let's call it August and September as we're sort of ramping up to high temperatures. What are the high temperatures in Chinon?
Yes, the hottest, as I say, I think it's 35 Celsius, which is 95 Fahrenheit degree in the summer. That's what we can get, and we get about 2,100 hours of sunshine in the period. 600 maximums millimeters of rainfall. It's not a very humid time. It's humid because of the river, because of the forest, because of this landscape, but we don't get that much rainfall, not as much as Bordeaux, for example. You are talking about Bordeaux; they get much more rain that we have in the Loire area. Of course, the global warming makes the things unfortunately different today.
We'll talk about that in a minute because I think that's important for my growing area. But John, let's talk about. Do me a favor. Will you hold up your North Coast label so that people can see? So Lang & Reed, North Coast. Let's see if we can get that a little bit. There you go. Can people see that? Lang & Reed, just spectacular wine. John makes 3 different Cab Francs, generally speaking, or maybe even more than that. But tell us about the differences between your 214 clone and your North Coast blend.
Well, they're really polar opposites, but they go back to the original idea of Lang & Reed. And while Mattieu was in school in Bordeaux, I was studying the Loire wines, where he was studying all the wines of the world I know. but I started the exploration of looking at what was sort of the model around the world for Cabernet Franc, because it is what I consider a very democratic grape in the fact that it has a wider ability to grow in much different types of climates. You can see it in the Finger Lakes. Obviously, it does. Middle Loire is really a spectacular area for it. Northern Italy, there are places down in Chile and Argentina where it's growing really well now. It is, I call the conservatively compassionate grape in the fact that here in California, it's a mid-season bloom and a mid-season ripener. So it oftentimes makes it through the frost season without any damage. And generally during the harvest season, we will harvest a couple weeks before the tsunami of Cabernet Sauvignon comes in. And it's generally before we have any inclement fall weather coming in. So it's very moderate in that respect. It can be more than shy bearing. It can actually bear too much if it's in really deep, fertile soils. So pruning is a really important aspect. I think in California, when the rage of planting Cabernet Franc and the other Bordeaux varietals besides Cabernet Sauvignon became the vogue, which was sort of the early to mid 70s. Vintners were doing it because they were discovering an affinity to Bordeaux. And so they thought, well, if a little bit is good, a lot is better. And so they would start with the base of Cabernet Sauvignon and bring these other grapes to them. But yet we really didn't have the accumulated knowledge of rootstock and signwood, where Cabernet Franc would excel. It was generally put in as an afterthought because it was more marketing to have it on your label as opposed to what effect it had on your blend. And then secondly, I was there in the early 80s. We made all the varietals about the same way. Pinot Noir was kind of made the same way as Cabernet, and it wasn't until a decade later where we started to differentiate this. I will mirror what Mattieu said about the transparency of Cabernet Franc. It is really an ancient variety of grapes. Obviously, the progenitor to Cabernet Sauvignon, having its one-night stand with Sauvignon Blanc
Right.
500 years ago.
Right.
Both of them are ancient grapes, and Aaron Pott, who cut his teeth in Pomerol and loves Cabernet Franc and talks about it in the New World, says old vines tend to be more transparent of where they're planted and the conditions they're grown in. And transparent can be good or bad. So if it's not a great vineyard, it might expose that quicker than some other variety.
Right.
But when it is in the right spot, it really, really shines. And that's what we, over the 25 years of purchasing and working with Cabernet Franc in 6 different counties in California, that's where I start feeling like we've honed down what are the ideal circumstances for the grape, for the types of wine we make. The North Coast is a blend of different appellations. It's 3, this particular glass, the 17 that we're tasting, is from 3 vineyards in Lake County, 1 vineyard in Alexander Valley, and 1 vineyard in Napa Valley. The Lake County fruit constitutes almost 2/3, maybe a little bit more, and it differentiates itself in the fact that it's not a coastal climate in Lake County, it's more of a high elevation, but yet we still get what Mattieu was talking about, sort of was the heat accumulation during the day and then the cooling at night, which is brought by the river. In Lake County, it's brought by the altitude. The 214 bottling, which would be considered in Middle Loire, our Van de Garde, is a single vineyard in Napa Valley called Sugarloaf Mountain Vineyard, and a single clone called Ontov 214, thus the name. And this was a clone that came to the United States with a small cadre of other Cabernet Franc clones in the early 90s. And this was the only one that was ever identified to us or brought to California, identified as a Loire origin. So when I found it commercially planted, I started working with this fruit in 2007 in a very, very cool spot in the very southeastern corner of Napa. You can actually see San Francisco Bay from this vineyard. And it, to me, was one of the most purest expressions of Cabernet Franc that I had seen in a California vineyard up to that point. So we kind of went with it as a single expression.
Mattieu, just a quick question about clones. sometimes we get obsessed with clones in California, especially on the Pinot Noir side. But Cabernet Sauvignon, as at one of my brands, Stephen Kent Winery, focuses on Cabernet Sauvignon, and clonal material, clonal differentiation of the wines is a real thing, obviously. I don't know that it trumps winemaking, certainly, but it does differ. The clonal representation in the wines will definitely change from site to site. Do winemakers in Chinon think about clones?
Yes. And if you go to the nursery and you ask for new vines, they will ask you which clone do you want. So to 10, yes, to 10, to 12, 623, to 14. But since 1990, we have decided to make our own Massal selection. So all that we are planting from 1990 and that we are renewing comes from the Massal selection that I make with my dad for, yes, more than 20 years now. So we have a mother vine called Les Gréseaux. And from that vines, we try to go quite often and check what we feel okay. And we have our own, we have a private nursery where we can get our own vines and get the Massal selection. That means that I'm not against clone, because 214, for example, it's a nice clone from the Valais. When I have some vines like Les Granges, which are from quite sandy, gravelly soils, 213 make them very balanced, very regular. That's fine. But somewhere I like the diversity. I like the way that different people can mix together, and some big cluster, big grapes, they can make nice wine. It's not just the perfect grapes doesn't make the perfect wine. There's something that you can't understand like this, but there's something about the flavors, and for us, Massal selection makes the perfect mix, and so all what we plant now is from that kind of selection.
You know what, we find the same thing. My winemaking team here at Stephen Kent or Lineage, our Bordeaux property, that there's a complexity sort of built in from the ground up when you're using multiple clones. Each of these clones expresses itself differently structurally, aromatically, flavor-wise. And when you start adding these subtle, kind of the spice rack of the chef, as it were, when you start adding these subtle differentiation of all of these elements together, you build something synergistically that's just beautiful. And although you wouldn't necessarily be able to define one clone from the other in these blends, if you start taking them out, you do notice a difference, and the wine is a lessened experience, I think, than when you have all of these things blended together. Mm-hmm. Livermore is a growing area that's just now beginning to understand how great it can be for Cabernet Franc, in my opinion. And Livermore, you probably don't know where that is, Mattieu, but we're about 70 miles south of Napa, and about 35 miles east of San Francisco. So our valley, our valley's opened up to San Francisco Bay. So we end up being a very cool appellation when you look at degrees days, when you look at other measures of heat summation. It's a much cooler growing area than most people think. Most people think this is the Central Valley, but it's actually, in my opinion, an area that is cooler than St. Helena North in terms, especially the further east you go up against the foothills. And one of the wines that we're pouring today, L'Autre Côte Gilmetti Vineyard, comes from the Gilmetti Vineyard, which is sort of the easternmost major vineyard in Livermore, right up against hillsides. In 2020, a victim of the smoke issues that we had from Napa and Santa Cruz coming north. And because of that hillside, captures a lot of cool air that kind of pools right on top of the vineyard. So I think a vineyard that's going to end up being especially important for Cabernet Franc as climate change affects things a little bit east of us. But so I heard, and I hope this rumor is correct, did you receive the wines from California today?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm
So
sharing these wines with you. Yes.
what what do you think of the wines? Tell us.
Yes, no, but I have just opened them about 1 hour ago, so that's fine. No, I have started by your wine, Stephen, the L'Autre Côte, the 2017, this wine. I don't know if you can
Thank you.
see me. Yes, very expressive, quite rich, but very juicy, very open, very easy to drink. So no, I feel very well with them. It's a different expression of the Cabernet Franc that I know from my area. As you, when you taste my wines, they are different than yours, of course. But I feel something very drinkable, very fresh. Tannins are very soft, well rounded, and that's nice. I had the Long and Reed, the Cabernet Franc from John. So the last the 17 as well, very juicy. Maybe not as rich, but very drinkable. But the 2016, the 214, wow! I smell the truffles, and it's amazing. I'm very surprised. That's the first nose reminds me a bit of 2003, which was a warm year. We had that kind of truffle smells, and I like this type, but because I feel something from the grounds, and no, very nice. But I did not open already your other wines, Stephen, the Lineage in the Premier. So should I open them?
No, you can certainly open them if you like. They're not Cabernet Franc. They're kind of a present, show you what other things we're concentrating on. Would love to get your impression. Love to share wine with people. That's what wine's all about. And we're enjoying your wines here too. And somebody asked a question about who imports your wines into the U.S. and in California. So Kermit Lynch is your importer in the U.S.?
Yes, Kermit Lynch imports my wine in California, but I have another importer in New York called Louis Dresner. And I feel very lucky because those two importers are great importers. They are friends, first of all, and they are very faithful people. They like wines. They like to come. We meet each other quite often, and I feel so happy that to have that kind of ambassador, we say in French, in the US area.
If you live in Northern California, live in the Bay Area, if you have not been to the Kermit Lynch wine shop, you're missing out on a great experience. We actually went. Beth Refsnyder and Aiden Mirassou, my two assistant winemakers, went to Kermit Lynch yesterday, I think, right? And picked up a case of your wine, and we're enjoying 3 of them right now. John's wines are always showing beautifully. His 2016, there is an earthy
Yes.
sort of, it's not even just a note. It's a very, I think, substantial part of the foundation of the wine, and it's just showing really beautifully. And we had the great good fortune, Nancy Castro, and my fiance and I had great fortune going to taste with Tracy and John, and tasted some of his older wines from 2007 and 2010, and they were fantastic as well. So it's great to see the ageability of Cab Franc.
It is, to me, it's phenomenal, and what it taught me really early on, because Dick Ward was like Dan Duckhorn, was a good friend and mentor of mine at the time that I started Lang and Reed. And Dick used to always say to me, he says, it's okay that you can see through a wine. Great wine doesn't need to be opaque. And coming from a Cabernet producer's perspective, it was sort of, in those days for Napa Valley in particular, was the bigger, the more robust, the more extract, the better. And having trained in art school, I always remember Mies van der Rohe, who said less is more. And reflecting back on Mattieu's comments about the fact that the food affinities for Cabernet Franc is really broad, because it does have this very juicy, lifted quality. It is very fresh. One of my favorites, of course, is I like all of Mattieu's wines, and have cut my teeth on them since the early 90s. Le Croix Boisé is just a knockout. I mean,
It's fantastic.
it is really
Yeah.
incredible. And it actually, even though I know it's not by your truffle farm, that too, I get a little bit of truffle aromatics in that too. One thing I want to congratulate Mattieu. I haven't sent this to him yet because I have a really bad machine, but Mattieu's Bernard Baudry wines, through their distribution, arrived this year on the Wine and Spirits Top 100 Wines for Wine list, which is pretty amazing. I think it might be one of the first times that Loire producers wound up on that list, and I know that they've made parts of the list in the past, but this time he's actually charting within the top 100 on restaurant wine lists in America, which is pretty amazing. It's pretty neat.
That is really, really neat.
Congratulations, Mattieu.
Absolutely, congratulations.
Merci beaucoup.
We've been making Cab Franc. We've been making Cab Franc since 2005. I think was our first vintage in the Livermore Valley, and I really fell in love with the variety in its Loire Valley, general Loire Valley shape in other your countrymen's wines at Kermit Lynch, Giguet and Breton, some of these amazing offerings. And there was just kind of going back to the transparency aspect of Cab Franc, there was a transparency aspect aromatically. It's certainly not as big a wine as Cabernet Sauvignon is. From the color, from the overall just sort of weight of the wine in the mouth and the richness of aroma, these are not as big, generally speaking, as Cabernet Sauvignon. But where I find the wines to be especially magical is how incredibly expressive they are and how rich they are in structure in the mouth. That acid-driven structure is something that I think is always the best food and structure kind of matrix, as it were. But whenever I taste great Cab Franc, there's a sort of bottomless pool that I'm thrust into that's a magical thing, because you can never really get to the bottom of where all this complexity is coming from. And though it's not as rich and big and extracted as Cabernet Sauvignon is, it's much more interesting. And I make a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon, so I have a vested interest in people still buying Cabernet Sauvignon. But personally, my favorite grape, Cabernet Franc, and there's just a magical kind of relationship between myself as a wine lover and as a person who happens to make wine as well, and this ethereal structure that is ethereal only in terms of weight, certainly not ethereal in terms of detail and precision and flavors. It's just it's a grape that just rewards sort of an exploring mind and palate. I think best grape out there for that, I believe.
So you're right. I think that, sorry, I really agree, and I think that Cabernet Franc, it's somewhere in the tannins. The tannins of the Cabernet Franc and the Cabernet Franc, it's always elegant. They are fine, refined tannins, and you can get the structure from La Croix Boissé, as you said. But all the wines that I'm drinking actually with you, the tannins are always very smooth, very elegant, and it's for me, it's one of these grape, quite full-bodied, quite rich, structured, but always with elegant tannin. So I don't want to compare with Cabernet Sauvignon or some other grapes, but the Cabernet Franc itself gives that richness, that these flavors, this transparency with the soil that I like, but always with elegance. If it's not elegant, as John say, it's because the terroir is not there. And of course, it's like the Chenin Blanc. Chenin Blanc and Cabernet Franc, if you don't get the right soils, you will get something bad, not interesting. But as soon as you get it on the right climate, the right terroir, and the terroir is the combination of the soil, climate, microclimate, the landscape, it's nice. But if you get it from somewhere that doesn't suit well, no, it will make a bad wine. Some other grapes, they can match with different kind of soil. Cabernet Franc won't.
I agree with you. A couple of questions about where to find the wines. In most cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but you can ship to most states in the union, including Florida.
There's only 3 we can. So.
And the same for us. So you can go to l'Autre-Côte-Cabernet-Franc.com for our wines. Website for Lang & Reed?
Langandreed.com.
That was easy. I was going to guess that.
But you have to spell the "and" out.
There you go.
It doesn't take an ampersand.
And Nancy will send details about where to find the wines for those who are joining us. Kermit Lynch does have great distribution, and Louis Dresner on the East Coast. Winesearcher.com. You should be able to find places to get Mattieu's wines outside of California.
Well, look at it this way.
Yeah.
If he made the top 100 list and you and I didn't,
yeah, exactly.
you're going to find it in great restaurants.
There's no question. And by all means, please support the Baudry effort, as it were. We're going to round things up here in a couple of minutes. We're looking for some last questions. If anybody wants to take the bottle shape different with l'Autre-Côte and Lang & Reed. True. And you're following maybe the sort of Loire Valley tradition,
right?
With
And
shape.
I have known Mattieu since 1997, so it has been a while. He had just graduated from, he just received his certificate from the university that day, and I think one of the exciting things about meeting his parents and Mattieu and Hélène was they were really excited that we were excited about their wines, and we've always had this discussion. It's kind of sometimes intellectual that there's no way that I can make wines that taste like they're from the Loire Valley out of Cabernet Franc. And that's kind of the neat thing about the grape itself, is that it is very expressive of the places that it grows. So I can really be inspired. I am very inspired by the wines of the Loire Valley, but I definitely have a California bent on it. And some of it has to do with obviously the soils we're in. More often it's really our climate and our positioning and that sort of thing. But Cabernet Franc does have its ability, good or bad, to be, like we've talked about, being very transparent. You have to try a lot of them. That's really important.
Absolutely.
For all 3 of us, that you try everybody's Cabernet Franc. But I sort of lost the question.
Someone asked a question about bottle shapes.
Oh, bottle shapes.
Yes.
So because of the inspiration of the Loire and living in Napa Valley, where it is very sort of Bordeaux mentality centric, we just sort of marched to a beat of a different drummer. And because we were inspired by the wines from the Loire, we took that as a signal that it would be in the shape that we have decided. Originally, I took a lot of heat for it because people assume that because it's in the Bordeaux family, it would be in a Bordeaux shape. And we had a lot of retailers in particular who said, I could sell 5 times as much of this if you put it in a Bordeaux bottle. And we kind of stayed true to it. We still are. I think in a certain way, the way we sort of intellectualize what we want to approach Cabernet Franc like aligns us a little bit closer to Pinot Noir. Not that we're trying to be Burgundians, because we can't be that either.
Right.
But it sort of reflects that ethos.
I wanted to put my wine in cubes, but the rest of my production team said that was a stupid idea, and they were probably right. My affinity for Cabernet Franc personally is Loire Valley expression in a general way. We just happened to come upon a design for packaging that we really liked, and because we're a very small producer, we only make at this point about 300 cases of Cab Franc. We sometimes have sort of production restrictions in terms of bottle shapes and the like, and decided to go this route. Doesn't mean it won't change down the road, although that's probably unlikely. But it doesn't have anything necessarily to do with an affinity for, in my case, for Bordeaux versus Loire Valley or what have you. I'm looking at the chat box, trying to answer any questions that I can see here that are obvious. So someone mentions, and thank you, Lori, not sure if it was mentioned, Cabernet Franc Day is December 4th. So every day in my book is either Sparkling Barbera Day, and that's usually from 8 o'clock in the morning till about 10 o'clock in the morning. After 10 o'clock, it's Cabernet Franc Day. So we'll certainly be doing some stuff at the winery on December 4th to celebrate Côte and celebrate Cabernet Franc. But from my perspective, Cabernet Franc is one of those wines that is great with just about everything that you can possibly pair it with. It is, as I've noted, because I think this way sometimes, it's one of those varieties that is, without doubt, sexy as all get out. There's just something about the way the wine feels and tastes that is amazing. So we greatly appreciate you being with us. We're going to go ahead and just show you really quickly kind of what we're drinking here and the wines that we have on our table, so that if you wanted to search these wines out, you'd be able to get them. John, you want to go ahead and show me, just remove the chat box so I can see. Do you want to
show you what's in my glass?
Show you what's in your, just show us what's, go ahead and show Mattieu's wine, since you have the bottles over there,
right? What
we're actually drinking from.
Well, in my order, from left to right, my left to right, I started with Lagrange, and then I went to Domaine, and then Le Boisé. So I know that this was not linear going up the side of the hill, because I believe Lagrange is mostly down in the sandier soils, and I know Lagrange is on the top, and Le Boisé is sort of in the middle.
Did he get that right?
Did I get
Mattieu?
that right, Mattieu?
He's really good. He really is.
He is.
I could taste that.
There you go.
Actually, I always look at your maps. Your maps are really great. Well, I know Lagrange is kind of close to your house, and but the last time I visited you guys was in 2014, and the day your father kidnapped me from reading my book while you guys were all at market, we went and walked Le Boisé, both on the Chenin side and then over to the Cabernet Franc. And it wasn't so much that he was giving me a tour as much as we were taking bug traps and finding out what bugs had been in the vineyard and sending it back to the experimental station. But it was a great afternoon. Now, I know we were late for dinner, but you guys didn't really mind. But I always find Lagrange, to me, is always that sappy, this is kind of like the everyday, like bring me a flagon of something cool and something franc. Le Grézo is always a little bit more serious. It's a little earthier expression. It doesn't quite jump out at the glass of let's drink more of it like the Lagrange does, but it always has sort of a little bit more, not linear, but it's a little bit more thoughtful in terms of the beginning all the way to the end. It doesn't burst on you like Lagrange does. And then Le Boisé is really, I can only reflect that a lot of my understanding of balance was based upon the wines like Le Boisé and Le Clos Guillot, which are at first immediately wanting to drink it and then realizing that there's really this secret that sort of unfolds while it opens up in your glass. I'm often accused of having like 3 glasses of wine on my kitchen counter with sight glasses so bugs don't fall into it, and tasting these wines like 7, 10 hours and then to the next morning. And they really have this ability to continue to age, and not that you would do that in service, but the wines definitely all deserve a little bit of air, as I think most wines do, all deserve a little bit of air before they're put into service. But Lagrange, you could pull right out of the cellar, have some grills, maybe grilled salmon with it too. It's light enough to, the tannins aren't big enough to force a seafood dish not to be enjoyed. But
great acidity of these wines too.
Yeah, they really are.
Just really beautiful paste through the mouth and great length in these wines. Just gorgeous.
People always ask me what's the best thing to drink with Cabernet Franc, and I always say really good friends first, because if you don't share good wine with friends, you've missed the point.
Absolutely.
But whenever I'm in the Loire, I eat fresh from left to right, fresh to aged goat cheese and Riette. And Riette in the Loire Valley is pork.
There you go.
Rendered. Everybody has their own recipe, so there's just a never-ending myriad of of different flavors and tastes. But those two elements together with a little fresh bread is really, to me, I'm in heaven.
Fabulous. Tell us about your wines too, John,
Okay,
please.
so I don't have them in my glass because I'm still smelling through Mattieu's wines. The 2017 North Coast, again, a compilation, a blend of different clonal selections, different terroir, and different fermentation techniques with each of the 5 different components. Sort of a winemaker's dream, because I get to do this sort of in the kitchen sink and blending. I love to blend things. But 100% Cabernet Franc. Then the 214, which by contrast is the single vineyard, single clone. This is really dependent upon its site and the people who are growing the grapes on our behalf, because there's only so much I can do in the wine making to find that complexity from sort of a monoculture. The vineyard is on a very, very severe slope, so there is a top, middle, and bottom, and it does have that kind of expressiveness. And then the last one we're drinking, which I actually sent to Mattieu so he would share it with his father, Bernard, because in 2011, when Mattieu's parents, Henriette and Bernard, visited Tracy and I pulled a lot of wines out that week for him. And this wine was still in barrel at the time. And this was a single 2 barrels that we made back in 2010 of a vineyard that is now gone. It is a Franc de Pied, which is defined by foot of the Franc is the literal translation, and just meant that this vineyard was bare rooted, which is fairly rare. It's very, very rare in the New World. And I was actually exposed to this idea of a bare rooted Cabernet Franc on my visits to the Loire and visiting Mattieu and his father Bernard. So we made 2 barrels. It actually was a base wine for the North Coast, but the vineyard I was no longer going to be getting grapes from this back in 2010, so I set aside 2 barrels and bottled it on its own. And we are finally just now bringing it to market 11 years later. So I sent it to you, Mattieu, so you would share it with Bernard.
I will, for sure. I will, for sure.
Report back. Let us know what your father thinks. So on the L'Autre Côte side, we are pouring 2018 Livermore Valley. So this is a blend of Cab Franc from Gilmetti Vineyard and Sakal Vineyard, are 2 fruit sources at this point in time. So kind of a vineyards in the eastern edge of the appellation, Gilmetti Vineyard and Sakal Vineyard more in the center, separated by a couple hundred feet of elevation, separated by age of planting, separated by clones and that sort of thing. So I think beautiful expressions of the grape and blended together in a way I think that works beautifully. 18 vintage. And then we've got our 2 single vineyard wines. So we've got L'Autre Côte Cab Franc from Gilmetti Vineyard and Sakal Vineyard separately. 2017 vintage in this case. L'Autre Côte's brand new. So we did like 40 cases of each of the first 2 2017 wines, and then the 18 vintage, a couple hundred cases. So we're just starting out on our Cab Franc trajectory. Looking very much forward to finding other sources around California and in Livermore Valley as we plant more clonal material here. We do have a 2020 Bates Ranch Cab Franc from the Santa Cruz Mountains. Very excited about that wine. Whole different growing area, a very different wine. Very excited about that. We again just want to thank you so much for being here. I'm certain. Hopefully Mattieu and John had a good enough time to do this again at some point down the road. And I'm going to be knocking on Mattieu's door at some point here relatively soon in Chinon, because I want to learn more about his wines and about the region. And John, thanks so much for your friendship and for being an inspiration for Cab Franc in California. We appreciate you tuning in, appreciate all the questions and chats. And as we said, we'll get back on the wine, where to find them and that sort of thing. But just want to say thank you to everybody. John, any sort of summing up you want to?
Well, I have to put my thanks to Stephen and Nancy, who spearheaded this when they came to visit us over in St. Helena a couple months back. And whoever thought that at the end of the pandemic, hopefully, knock on wood, that we would be able to take something that happened, that basically a forum that was created for us by this incredibly disastrous pandemic, which was the ability for us all to sit around, because I know that there's a lot of people from all over the world on this today that we're able to sit down and enjoy these wines. And if you don't have them in front of you, I urge you to put them in front of you, because they're really exciting wines, and it's really fun to see the ships all rise in the harbor as Cabernet Franc rises to more popularity.
Takes over the world 1 acre at a time, or something like
Right. And Mattieu, do you have any wisdom from us about drinking Cabernet Franc?
No, when I listen to you, and I feel that I feel so happy to share the passion of wine making, of wine drinking, and I remember all those great times we had, and I'm very happy to have that nice familyship. And Stephen, you are welcome whenever you like to come in Chinon, and I can bring you, as I did with John and Tracy and the family, to visit the vineyards and to share some nice bottle of wines, some old bottle of wines. I like old wines. I like as well to show how Cabernet Franc can evolve, can age. That's a great grape for aging as well. And even if the world go quick and we are drinking very young wines, this kind of wines, they can age perfectly as well, and that's the great quality of Cabernet Franc as well.
Mattieu, thank you so much. Be careful what you offer. That I hear a knocking on your front door right now. In fact, we will definitely take advantage of that. We really enjoyed getting a chance to talk with you, and I feel like I've got a friend in Chinon now, and looking forward to getting your advice about Cab Franc and as we move forward. Laura, you want to take your microphone off and ask a question? I think you had your hand up. Laura Ness.
Hi, Stephen and John and Mattieu. It's really wonderful to hear all your impressions about the wines. Do you have any idea how many acres of Cabernet Franc are planted around the world?
Ooh, I could give that a stab. I have a chart, and there's about 40,000 acres. So in Bordeaux, so that's 18,000 hectares. It's similar in the Loire, but just a little bit less. I think it's more like 35,000 acres. In Napa Valley, there's now 1,200. When we started, there were 900. But to put it in perspective, when we started in '96, there were 12,000 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon, and now there's 24,000 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon. So that's what has made Cabernet Franc the most expensive red grape in Napa County at this stage. I can't remember the total in the state, but it's not huge. It's not like more than 10 or 12,000 acres in total.
There were only about 13,000 tons of Cab Franc processed in 2019.
Okay.
So it's not a lot of acres. I think there may be 30 or 40 acres in all of Livermore Valley at this point in time. So, we really believe in this area, and because of climate change and the way it's affecting wind and ripening times here in our valley, that it becomes a much better grape to grow long term than Cabernet Sauvignon. Because as the growing day gets shorter, as the wind comes through, you need a longer growing season to get a fully ripe grape. And we may run into rain at some point, early December with Cabernet Sauvignon. So we're betting a lot on the future of Cab Franc here in the valley, and really excited about seeing what we can do. There's a bunch of producers here in the valley who are doing a really nice job with Cab Franc, and I think there will be a bunch more doing more over time, which is really exciting.
Mattieu, off the top of your head, do you know in general Loire Valley how many acres or hectares are planted to Franc? It's a hard number.
I know, but Chinon, I think that Chinon is about 2,500 hectares. So there's a conversion to do.
Right.
And Bourgueil, Saint-Nicolas, it's about the same, and Saumur, not so far. So, and then there are some Cabernet Franc blended with Cabernet Sauvignon in the Touraine area, northern that my region. So no, I can't tell you exactly how many hectares.
hopefully growing all over the world. Mary Orland, you had a question?
Hi, Stephen. Yes, you mentioned Gilmetti's in the eastern part of Livermore Valley. I was just wondering, is that the best place in Livermore to grow Cabernet Franc, or are there other parts of the valley that are suited to the grape as well?
That's a good question. I mean, there's so little planted right now that I can kind of rely on the areas that we've been getting Cab Franc from for a number of vintages. I think that one of the things that makes Livermore interesting from a growing standpoint is just its relationship to wind. My family planted grapes in the Salinas Valley in the early 1960s, and that may be the most wind affected appellation in the US, certainly in California. And Livermore is getting to be more and more like that all the time. As weather changes, gets hotter over on the other side of the Altamont Pass, it seems to draw air in with more speed and earlier in the day. Vines don't like a lot of wind. They tend to shut down, stopping photosynthesis for the day. So you get shorter growing days that mean you need a longer growing season to get stuff ripe. Gilmetti happens to be right up against the Altamont Pass, that little hills, that little range of hills that the Altamont Pass runs through. So it tends to break buds a couple of weeks later than like our home ranch or Sockau Vineyard in the middle of the appellation, and then consequently ripens a couple of weeks later. So it's so far, in my opinion, it shows a distinctiveness of Cab Franc in terms of fruit and acid drive that I absolutely love. My favorite site so far. I think Sockau is a great site, and as more gets planted, we'll know more about Livermore Valley. But I think Gilmetti is the best vineyard in the valley so far in terms of Bordeaux varieties. But I think Cab Franc is as good there as there's any place.
Do you know of any other vineyards in the valley that you think are notable?
Well, I think Sockau certainly is notable. There's a little piece that was just planted by the Wenties over by their golf course that I think has potential, although I think they may only have gotten their first vintage in 2019. There are a couple of other small sites that have a few acres here, a few acres there. We haven't worked with the vineyards personally. I've tasted some made by our cohort here in Livermore, and some of the wines have been really quite good. But the names of the vineyards escape me at the moment, and there really isn't much acreage planted at those sites independently. So talk to me in a few years about that specific question, and I'll have more information for you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the questions. Again, thank you very much. We'll definitely be doing this again. We obviously, the three of us love Cab Franc. I know that everybody on my team loves Cab Franc, and we look forward to sharing more and more with you, more stories about the growth of this variety in our areas and about our love of the grape. And just want to thank you all for being here, and go out right now and pour yourself a big old glass of Cab Franc to celebrate our first aesthetic contemplation. And we're going to have
dinner, Mattieu, right?
Or a dinner for Mattieu. And we're going to have we'll use here in Livermore. Again, thank you all very much. Cheers to all of you. Cheers to all the wine lovers out there.
Mattieu, à bientôt.
À bientôt.
À bientôt. Bye-bye, my friends.
Merci beaucoup.
Say hi to your parents.
Thank you all.
I will. Thank you.
That last sip is worth 1,000 words, right?